But here we go. Gladly, as I said, we had a fantastic introduction to some of the topics that we are discussing now, which is the next generation of caller ID, so identifying who the caller is. And stir-shaking, blockchains, and much more, because there are multiple views. Something that I thought, maybe, James, I thought that it was just a question of light touch or hard touch regulation. I think Simeon was also talking about enlightened regulations, which, nirvana of it all. So should we know more? Let the regulator on the side. If you are an MNO, if you are an aggregator, you should know about this. Because apart from everything else, he might have a very big impact on your business. And potentially the life of your customers, something very big. But your business as well. So we got no one, not two, not three, but many, 5 speakers to tell us more and tell us what's really happening out there. I would like to welcome, here they are, I think starting what I think our 3 here in present speakers, Vasily Birulin. Vasily, please come, from the AB Handshake Corporation, the managing director. We also welcome Lucian Gheorghe, first CTO from TMO Analysis, and Eli Katz, the CEO from Xconnect. And then online, as we speak, we should have Ira Cohen, the VP of Business Development and Marketing at MMDSmart. Hello, Iron. And we should also have Catalin Badea, the Director of Product Management Data Services for NetNumber. Thank you, and let's welcome all of them. Thank you for being here. So let me ask the first question. Slightly, it might not be redundant after what we heard as well, but do we have a problem with the nuisance calls, the robocalls, the caller elements? And is that also equivalent in the messaging world as well? So do we have a messaging and calling problem? Before I share some of our numbers from our own consumer research, let's go to all of you. I'll start with Eli. Eli, as you're the first in line here. Can you tell us, do we have a problem, first of all? Is there such a thing?
I think clearly, if we look at the overall growth of the A2P volume from a messaging perspective, this is something that's simply going to be attracting, as we see day in, day out, the opportunity for spammers and spoofers to generate messages. And the pain is that, as we heard from the sessions over the last, just before, from Simeon and from earlier from yesterday, with that volume of growth, we're going to see the bad actors taking the opportunity. And the more that is kind of appearing in front of, on newspapers, on scare stories, on genuine horror stories, then it doesn't help our industry in any way whatsoever. So to define it, whether the users perceive it or not, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's a perception of there is an issue out there, there is a lack of trust that is growing in the industry about the caller ID that's being presented, about the trust in those messages that are coming out. And if we as an industry don't do anything about it, then we as an industry will go the same way as kind of email turns out to be. And we need to ensure that we are doing the best that we can, no magic answer, doing the best that we can to continue and to develop that restoration in trust in the messaging that we have.
Thanks. Let me bring you to online, and there we have Catalin. Catalin, can you tell us what's your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. So there is definitely a problem with robocalling. I think the size of the problem depends from geography to geography, especially North America seems to be, I would say, the most effective volume-wise by robocalls. I would have said until recently, for example, in Germany, where I'm in, I wouldn't get such calls, but actually I did get some robocalls recently. So it seems that it's no longer isolated only to the traditional geographies. And caller ID spoofing is an important element that bad actors are using in order to make this robocall successful. They're usually impersonating a number that is trusted by the recipients in order to increase their response rate to those calls.
Thanks. I'm going to turn it back here, and we have a few of you. I'm probably starting with Vasily now. Vasily, what do you think?
Oh, well, in general, I definitely concur with what I said before. I would also put on top of that because we're operating this anti-fraud solutions, and we generally currently see the uplift in all types of fraud, not only this robocalls and CLI spoofing. So in general, that Corona times, they stabilized the voice market in general, and there was even the uplift in the volumes, and definitely that triggered the actions by this man in the middle. So I would say that definitely there is a problem with robocalling, with CLI spoofing, but it also goes beyond with this Vangiri and all types of fraud that are being imposed on the voice. But also what is happening now, and this is why we are moving also from the voice area to the messaging. For example, these flash calls which are happening now, and I would say that the messaging community is being severely hit by these flash calls. So in general, I would say that yes, the answer is yes. So this, with a little bit of twist that the picture is a bit wider than it was anticipated before.
So it's not just a nuisance call, it's a caller ID could be a route.
Yeah, it can be applied in different fraud schemes, definitely.
Lucian, to conclude from this side, what do you think from Timo analysis?
Well, definitely, you know, as the other speakers say, there is a problem with robocalls, there is a problem with caller ID, sender ID spoofing. I think we need to do a few things. One, as an industry, to bring trust to the caller ID and sender ID, and you know there are these new initiatives like the stir shaking protocol. But you also saw the graphs earlier, and I think the other thing that we need to do and operators need to do is educate the consumers more on what happens after we solve the spam and authenticate caller IDs, in order to not fall for the scammers and the robocalls as well.
Thank you. You might have noticed I've left Ira out, but Ira, you've been elected here, selected as a representative, not on the solution side, but on the aggregator word, the C+ word, and so on. So Ira, what do you see from your side? Oh, you'll be muted by the supply side probably. So was that some sort of, were you doing it on purpose? There we go.
You hear me now?
There you go. So
right, thank you for
come and tell
me.
Oh, sorry. Come and tell us if you agree with them or there's no issues out there.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel, and I'm very honored to be elected to represent the industry. I don't know if the industry wants me to represent them, but I'll take the nomination anyway. Obviously, and Lucian actually used the key word here. The issue of trust is the key word, I think, that we're all looking at. Robocaller in the United States was a huge issue in October 2020. There were almost 6 billion robocalls in the United States. One of the reasons why the authorities in the United States in 1919 began working on the stir-shaken protocol, which the Canadian government also adopted as well. And as of November 2021, all calls sent to the United States must go through the stir-shaken protocol. Yes, it's a big problem, obviously. And even with stir-shaken, there's still a significant amount of robocalls that are going through today. The numbers are estimated still to be about 2 to 3 billion going through, even with the stir-shaken protocol. And what happened is that this leads to a tremendous deterioration of trust for the entire industry. Consumers don't see a difference between phone calls and text messages. It's all this telecom thing. It's all coming from their phone. And the lack of trust in the channel was a significant problem. If we're looking from the messaging side, obviously stir-shaken was only meant to go towards caller ID, or the caller ID that appears on the phone. And it's meant to be sort of the certification process so that any number is definitely certified to the company. We have the exact same issue, as we all know, with phishing in the SMS world. the fact of spoofing of PayPal or of FedEx and getting messages that they're spoofing that number. And so what we need from the messaging side is to initiate some sort of similar protocol that on the one hand will be across the entire industry, but will still let the aggregator community still continue ongoing and doing their business. And just as the last point on this, and if we don't act now, then what's going to happen is, and it's a recent press release, that Google, Apple, and Microsoft have agreed on a different type of protocol for OTP traffic, which they will do something outside of the messaging system, outside the SAX system. I don't have to tell the people assembled in this room what the loss of that OTP traffic from the biggest senders of OTP will do to the messaging business.
Okay, so I think you're all agreeing, and even if I try to set you against each other with IRA, it didn't work. The industry is really agreeing that something needs to be done. IRA also said, watch out, there are other solutions from the, let's say from the IT words. Regulations, we heard, is looking at this. So maybe a position, or at least an education is important. But I'm gonna read out what I started with this morning, the results of our consumer trust survey. So please download it. Where specifically the questions of, have things improved? Do you the controls for managing unsolicited messaging spams? Are things getting better or not? And actually, only 28%, which is still a large number, are saying that things are getting worse. Then 29% say there was no change, probably no change on a bad situation. Slightly improved, well, that's a surprise for me. 28% slightly improved, significantly improved 18%. So somehow, some users are either getting more accustomed to these, and I kept on bringing my phones because I get a phone call every day from nuisance, but something is happening, and I don't know. We're gonna revise whether it's really the US that is bringing down that numbers, or we'll think of it. But so far, probably the consumer is not overly concerned, which is my surprise, or don't think that things are getting that much worse. But let me separate that, and while we try to digest it, and you let me know if you have any comments, because there's so many things on the table, and I need somebody to help me out. We are talking about voice, because voice calls, but we want to see the impact on messaging as well. Simeon, we heard before from Adaptive Technology, says, well, things are so good on messaging, but that probably made things worse for robocalls on voice. Okay, help me out. What's the situation on voice? What's the situation on messaging? Probably what's the situation of email? I don't know. What's out there? I'm going to start with Lucian first and then ask the others. What do you think? Help us a bit to understand the differences.
Right. So I was talking about the caller ID spoofing, and when I was reading the stir shaking framework, I was thinking email, right? Because we had very large problems with email spoofing, and when you look at the stir shaking protocol from a technical perspective, it looks a lot like the domain key identifier mail, which didn't solve the email spoofing problem, but it reduced it a lot, and it looks like
it's actually based on SMTP protocol.
Yeah, and so it reduced it a lot, the spam in the email world, and that happened only when multiple, or there's a critical mass of email players adopting it. And it seems to me like we are just at the beginning of introducing trust in caller ID. Obviously, in messaging, there are other controls and other ways to do it. And we can look at this industry to see how it was done in the email world, what was good, what was bad, and how to do it further in order to have trust in those channels.
Thank you. Catalin, can you add something on the messaging threats or messaging differences with voice?
Yes. So I'm just building on what Lucian said. So I fully agree that from a StarShaken perspective, things are still at the very beginning. Even in the United States, where it's been deployed the earliest, there are actually 3 waves of deadlines when operators have to implement StarShaken. And the major operators, they've already implemented this. The deadline has passed. There is a second deadline now for a second group of operators end of June, and the last set of operators will have to implement StarShaken by June 2023. So from this perspective, it's still a bit early for definitive analysis and statistics, but what the data is indicating is that some of the robocalls have moved from those operators that have implemented StarShaken to those that haven't implemented yet. So it's obvious that the bad actors are looking for, I would say, the easiest way to continue to do that. And this is what actually made the FCC bring forward the deadline for this second group of operators to this June, because they were also part of the June 2023 deadline. So something is moving there. I would also add to that StarShaken by itself is not, the silver bullet that will stop robocalls. It's a tool to help with traceback. It's perfectly suited for that, but only in combination with effective traceback and the shutting down of the originators of the robocalls will this actually reduce the volume of those calls.
Fantastic. Eli, can you add to that?
Yeah, I think the first thing to step back is to look at the entire communications industry. And I think, as has been mentioned, there has to be a collective goal, both on the messaging side and on the voice side, to almost, I think the words I prefer to use is to restore trust in caller ID. When caller ID first came on the scene 20, 30 years ago, and it was only available kind of within your network, it was very controlled. There was no spoofing ability because it was only done within network. At that point in time, there was fundamental trust in caller ID. We've lost that completely, both on the voice side and on the messaging side, with the growing set of bad actors and a growing set of players. The industry is going to gain significantly, and again, I'm referring to both the voice side and the messaging side, by being able to go through a process of restoring that trust in caller ID. Just imagine when that is back together, the facilities you can do for identity management, things like rich caller ID, branded calling, all of this next generation capability can exist once we restore trust in caller ID. Now, on that big picture, we've got multiple industries. Within those industries, you have multiple segments. So just look at the voice side for a second. The USA has gone down one path, driven by the regulation. In fact, it actually needed an act of Congress to enable the FCC to be able to actually implement StarShaken and demand StarShaken from the industry. As some of you will know, there was a recent FCC announcement just a few weeks ago extending the reach of StarShaken not just to domestic USA calls, but even to international calls coming in to the USA. So there's definitely growth of the regulators trying to kind of expand their reach to the maximum possible. A number of countries, UK, Ireland, France, are going down a similar kind of a consultation process to develop StarShaken. We have to look at the lessons, that the pluses and the minuses of the USA. Clearly, we've seen it's been an interesting experiment, and $500 million worth of investment with a fairly small reduction means we're going to look at that and see how we can best take the best practices element of that. The perfect solution would be if there is a standards-based, open, global, on a multi-segment basis for voice and messaging. Ultimately, for the customer, they just need to restore that trust in caller ID. Unfortunately, I think it's probably a bit nirvana. I don't think we're likely to see a one global solution that's going to cover both industries and on a national and global basis. So we've got to try and do the best that we can, both at the global level, and the MEF is really well positioned to be able to help look at that on a global basis, but recognize that in reality it's going to be a lot driven by at the national level and by segments, and coming out with solutions to help that journey of restoring trust in caller ID to the best way possible, and we can talk through that later.
Okay, let me summarize some of the things we've mentioned today.
Can I ask, because I think it's one of the, well, just not to waste too much time, I think one of the quite important things if we compare what is happening in voice and messaging is that if we look at the market-wise, the playground of the affected players actually in messaging is wider. So what was happening in voice? It was consumers who were losing the trust towards the telcos. So it's two parties involved. In messaging, it's wider because it's both the consumers who are losing the trust towards the telcos, but also towards the enterprises. So enterprises are also severely hit with this A2P scam. And that's why I would say that in general, the severity, the business-wise, the severity of the problem is higher, even higher for messaging. It's still to come, I mean in volumes, but I would say that the momentum is bigger, is higher. I think that's the point that I wanted to add to this.
I would just comment briefly. There was an initiative that was taken both in the UK and in the USA of creating a do not originate list. It's a very interesting concept. And it addresses that the enterprise can be affected even on the voice side. So the classic case would be Barclays Bank does a major advertising and this is the 1-800 number or the 0800 number. Yeah. Of course, that is at that point a spoofer's dream, right? Of they spoof that number, phone up dear old granny, right? And say, listen, this is Barclays Bank speaking, please make sure you give me your account number, your details, etc., etc. And they tell the old granny, so look at the phone number, this is our number, open up any newspaper and you'll see this is the Barclays number. In that environment, both the UK and the USA started a concept of creating a do not originate list. And this do not originate list is published by the enterprises, by the Barclays banks, by the government organizations, saying these numbers should never be seen at all. And the new legislation that's being passed, both in the USA and in the UK, literally as we speak, right? A few weeks ago by the FCC, in a few weeks' time by the UK Ofcom, is going to be that all calls need to be screened against these do not originate lists. And all of this is part of that journey to that statement of we need to be able to restore the trust in caller ID. And it is impacting both on the enterprises and on the communication operators.
So for what I've heard so far, you all agree that there is a big issue there.
Yeah.
No, well, don't worry. I haven't completely forgotten about you. I got a questions. Don't worry. But I'm building up because you're representative for everybody else here. So there is an issue. We need to deal with it. The issue is multiplied on voice, and it's not just messaging. And Ira, you'll have to pay at least 500 million to sort it out. Are you happy with that?
I'm always happy to sort things out.
Okay,
I'm not sure you want to rely on me to do that, but I'm always happy. So just as a comment to one of the previous comments, ideally, as Eli said, it would be great if we had one standard way of verifying caller ID and sender ID, both via the exact same technology, et cetera. But there's a significant problem because StirShaken was developed to work on VoIP and not on SS7, specifically not on SS7. One of the reasons why Shaken was developed was to sort of do this migration from the VoIP towards the SS7 protocol. And so that would be great, but we would have to come up with something different. I think that what needs to be done, because in a similar way that the caller ID problem, in SMS we have the sender ID problem, is to go in and do more or less what StirShaken tried to do, which is to verify the brands, the major senders of voice, to make sure that all the traffic, all the voice traffic coming from those brands is verified to a specific set of numbers. And so we know that if somebody gets a call from Barclays Bank, that it is coming from Barclays Bank, because Barclays Bank is one of the brands that is verified on the StirShaken protocol. Whereas all the smaller players who aren't will not be in there, and so then we'd have to run other types of filters to filter out that traffic. We can do exactly the same thing globally for SMS. It doesn't have to be a geographic problem. We can actually make sure that all of the big brands sign up to some sort of protocol. We actually developed a protocol for this for SMS. Sign up for a specific protocol. All of the messages they send are encrypted, and then the terminating operator receives that encrypted message, which goes parallel to the existing SMS IP system. And then basically it's a secure encrypted SMS, except for the last mile between the terminating operator and the recipient. This is something, by the way, that is extremely doable. It doesn't require any big CAPEX investments. It just means signing up to agree to an existing encryption protocol for all of the players, and then every aggregator, every operator can still work. And it was said previously, The problem is on the enterprise side, and the ones who pay for it is the enterprise, because they're the ones who are suffering the pain, both in terms of loss of consumer trust, but in terms of financial institutions and e-commerce retailers, a tremendous financial hit as well. They're actually feeling the financial hit of phishing and of all of this robocalls that are stealing consumer identities. And so putting the onus of the payment, which is not a large payment, and I know the next comment will be, well, enterprises are always looking to save money, not the security departments of banks. They're not looking to save money, they're looking to keep their money. And so I think that we need to look at, and that's something that as a community we can come together on and agree on. And I think that part of the problem with STIR/SHAKEN, and this has been discussed both in the GSMA and the CTA and other industry organizations, is that it was focused on a specific geographic problem and not the more global problem, which is why they have to come out now and say that this also covers international calls coming in. We see a similar thing with in India, where there's a system to block smishing or fake SMS that Kamla has implemented, but that only covers the domestic traffic, not the international traffic. So we need to, I think, stay away a little bit from the geos and look at something that we can implement globally.
And then, thanks, Ira. So far, despite my vain attempt, you're all agreeing with each other. But it's a great thing. As MEF, I should be really happy. But something needs to be done. We should be doing it soon. So let me help me, and help to educate. We, in our title, mention a multiple. STIR/SHAKEN is obviously so big. It happens in US. It's been now analyzed in Europe. We've heard from Ira. There is a blockchain solution in India. There are other solutions. Let's talk about the tools available. Let's do some of that educations. What other things are there? Probably we'll start with Vasily. Is an interested party there as well.
That's an expected take because we are providing an alternative to STIR/SHAKEN. Yes, I think what is important, what we heard so far, is that STIR/SHAKEN initially was designed for IP-based networks. And also it is a sort of an in-band authentication. So you're really alert, you're actually inserting or you're injecting these signatures and certificates within the signaling. So it does affect severely the operators' networks. And there have been several times mentioned this $500 million of funds spent for that. We are providing an out-of-band because we decided to take a different approach, the out-of-band validation that eventually works both for IP and SS7, so any type of legacy networks. And it doesn't affect the network as severely as it does with the in-band. And practically, we managed to build the service which goes in a pay-as-you-grow model. So it's a software as a service practically. So there is zero capex associated with that. And you don't need to tap into the operator equipment. And just to finish this descriptive part, we are now trying to build the community around this because obviously what we are providing, this call validation service, is a community-based service. It's of course sometimes it's a chicken and egg problem because we have to play this puss and boots game because we need to bring to the community the parties which are exchanging substantial amounts of traffic so that they can feel the value of that. But at the same time, we would like to make this a snowball effect. We also quite tightly working with the regulators. So if you look at this latest CEPT report for anti-spam, for anti-CLI spoofing measures, we're listed there together with STIR/SHAKEN and with blockchain, with Seismic. The truth, the matter of fact is that currently, if you would like to go on the market and really install something which is tangible and working, there is STIR/SHAKEN, obviously, with all this consortium, but also that's ourselves.
Well, let me ask somebody that works in STIR/SHAKEN and also can tell us a different perspective, maybe from Canada as well. So, Catalin, can you tell us some more of the different solutions we are seeing emerging from that as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So indeed, from a StarShaken perspective, since NetNumber is a provider of StarShaken services to both US and Canada, I mean, building on what Vasily is saying, so true, it's mainly in-band. It's an identity header that has to be inserted in the SIP header for VoIP calls. However, it doesn't have to be like that. There is also an out-of-band option that is standardized by ATIS, the so-called call placement service. And this is something that in the voice world, it's meant to be used for those portions of the network that are non-IP, so for TDM. Now, it's not mandated yet that carriers have to also implement StarShaken for their non-IP portions of the network. I think many players in the industry expect that that's going to happen. And there is already, like I said, a standardized solution for out-of-band StarShaken implementation as well. And I think the interesting element there is that this out-of-band option might also be something that could work for messaging. There is a draft AT standard for messaging as well. It speaks about SIP. Now, the main transport protocols for messaging are SMTP or SS7, but that draft standard also speaks about the out-of-band option. So probably that's I think a way to consider for messaging.
Eli, do you want to add something? And I know that you're working in the UK, multiple hats you have, something you can tell us on that.
Yes, so briefly, just from the UK perspective, just to address Dario's point, which is, as I mentioned before, the UK industry, so I'm here wearing my chairman of the UK industry, IP communications providers called Communications Council UK. So the industry is definitely looking at, the regulators definitely looking at introducing StarShaken, the industry is looking at how it's going to respond to that. Clearly the results of the USA experiment, again, is going to clearly impact on that. On the other hand, the regulator might just kind of force its way through. It will probably have a UK flavour to it. It won't necessarily have the USA flavour to it. But I think the key point is to reflect on the previous comments, which is that looking on a global basis, definitely one element, which is that a concept of restoring the trust in the authenticated caller ID is going to benefit all parts of the industry. Point one. Point two is, if there is a mechanism that can work at both the voice and the messaging side, and to some degree it has been touched upon just recently, the out-of-band concept in StarShaken definitely makes a lot more both commercial sense. The cost of implementation of an out-of-band solution is magnitudes different from an in-band solution. Even where you don't have just TDM, even where you just the cost of an IP network, Vasily mentioned this indirectly before, the cost of an IP network to support an in-band solution is significant. That $500 million is because every component of a SIP path going from originator, transit, terminator, all of those parts all have to be upgraded to support an in-band solution. So the concept of an out-of-band, and together with our parent company, Somos, we're very involved in the definition of those standards. One of our key people is Chris Wendt, who was involved in the authorship of the Shaken aspect, and we're very much helping to develop the open standards around how an out-of-band capability will be, as well as, and just to comment on Ira's point, there's actually just recently a draft IETF standard which is looking to potentially help to introduce StarShaken, potentially an out-of-band version as well, into the messaging side. And that's not going to be a smooth, easy play to have. There's no SIP here, and there is SIP here, so that needs to be a bit more thought process. But the basic concept of helping to introduce authenticated capability via an out-of-band solution is definitely something that we as a company are very much involved in at the standards level. We believe this has to be driven on a global basis, and if there are solutions that can work together, both on the voice side and on the messaging side, that would be wonderful and perfect. Just one final point, which is that, as I say, this is a journey, right? The world is not going to suddenly change tomorrow morning. And what we're seeing that the regulators are doing as a first step on that restoration of trust in caller ID is looking at making sure that you're making a validation. You're checking your A number to ensure that your A number is a valid A number, at least that first step of that journey. And that means, is it coming from an allocated range? Is that information correct and accurate? Does it exist on a do not originate list? So this is something that the regulators today are already starting to push forward on that journey. And this is a capability that is available there for the industry to be able to utilize, and it's an important first step in that bigger picture.
Thank you. And Lucian, I'll ask the same.
Yeah, so on the messaging side, remember most of the aggregators and CPaaS players have out-of-band capabilities because they do number portability lookups, they do HLR lookups, and it's much easier for them to implement an out-of-band solution when it comes to sender ID authentication. In the voice industry, I agree, it's probably easier in terms of financials to develop an out-of-band solution rather than an in-band solution. However, I think it needs, we are talking about global efforts, we are talking about doing this one protocol for everybody, which is very difficult to do it on a global scale, and I think it needs to be driven by regulations, and I think it needs a critical mass in order to be adopted everywhere, and that's when you start actually restoring trust.
I would just comment on that, which is, yes, on one hand, we do need to have the regulators to kind of trigger that, but at the same time, it's up to us as an industry. If we take the initiative and move that forward, then we have a much better chance than simply some regulator who can make the right decisions, as we heard earlier from Simeon. They need to be informed, they need to be educated. If we leave it purely in the hands of a regulated-based approach, then we run the risk as an industry of not actually ending up in a good position at all. So I would definitely encourage the industry as much as possible, again, industry associations like MEF, like the i3 Forum, like other industry associations, to help the industry move forward so that we can take the initiative and end up with a solution that does work for the industry and not top down.
Just one thing to add about this out-of-band validation for messaging, because it's actually a little bit more complicated with the voice. With the voice, you have already split the signaling and the RTP itself. And with the messaging, we have an issue of actually out-of-band transmitting this message itself. So it can definitely cause this data privacy issues. So we were thinking about that, and one of the ways to tackle this is practically not to transmit the out-of-band message itself, but only the hash, the digital signature of the message. So you can compare it on both sides, because this is a serious challenge that would be that the industry would face with the out-of-band validation for messages.
Thank you. I know that. Ira, I'll again ask you to almost point the summary side from your side. What did you think so far? What's happening tools-wise? Have we got enough? Should we then start talking about geographic issues? Should we be talking about technical deployment? What's the next steps?
I don't think we have enough, and as I said before, and Eli also actually commented upon this. If we rely on regulators, or we rely on specific industry solutions from this provider or this provider rather than some sort of more global solution, we'll end up with a totally fragmented market, and the adoption of the tools, the necessary tools, will just take that much longer. So we have to be very careful about that. And as Dario, as you know, I'm always in favor of the industry taking the horns and moving forward and not waiting for the regulators, because the problem of robocalls in the United States has been a big problem for 15 years. It took them 15 to 20 years for them all to sit down and come up with a solution, which was only a partial solution, and as Catalin said before, it's still not fully implemented. Okay, so and as a result, they're still getting in not the same amount, but about half the amount of robocalls are still going into the market. So the deterioration of trust is continuing. So I think that we definitely need to take the bull by the horns and move it forward. And I think that we, as was mentioned before, we need to find a solution that will make sure that all of the, if we can verify the A numbers, we know that everything that's coming from this brand that is not from the A numbers is bad traffic. Everything coming from that. First, we need to make sure that we know what's good traffic, and then the firewalls can get rid of the bad traffic. We already have firewalls in place. So we need to look for some sort of a system. As I mentioned before, we've implemented a blockchain solution, which works really, really well. for financial services industries to prevent phishing. We know for sure that this is from Citibank, this is from MasterCard, this is for PayPal. Everything else is trying to send messages using Citibank, PayPal, or MasterCard is bad traffic because it's not coming, it wasn't verified. And it's not encrypted using the keys. And then you're not sending messages that can be intercepted along the way. You're sending gibberish, which can only be deciphered if I have the key that was sent to the message. And so
Thanks,
that's the sort of thing that the industry can implement tomorrow, frankly. And no one without any significant investments or trying to change an existing technology. And we as an industry need to go forward with that.
And thanks for that. Time is running out, so I think I'll have to be very fast on the next point. But there is a comment online, more than a question, is a comment about the impact of the verified credentials and what's happening out there. I have a question for all of you, so one more minute, at least some of you. But let's check if there is any media question from the room. If not, there is one from Igor.
I have a question. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I have a question towards the panel about the actual teamwork, perhaps, with the regulators, because STIR/SHAKEN was introduced in 2019. I mean, the Trace Act, the legislation for it was in 2019, and apparently throughout those 3 years, there's been some industry feedback. There's obvious need to validate international calls, whereas STIR/SHAKEN currently is concentrated on U.S. market only. Obviously, the operators are interested in actually expanding the anti-robocall legislation and anti-robocall technologies abroad, and also since the STIR/SHAKEN itself would like to expand internationally. Is there a chance that the regulators would take into account all those things and perhaps like modify the legislation to include all those inputs from the industry, from international regulators, etc.?
Who would like to go for it? Eli is raised hands.
I'm happy to take. So listen, as you mentioned, the US regulator, FCC, literally just a few weeks ago, passed that first set of legislation expanding the remit of STIR/SHAKEN on international calls coming into the USA. And that's kind of the border for them, right? The FCC cannot start instructing other countries to do X, Y, Z. But the first step they can take is to mandate STIR/SHAKEN attributes, validation. That's the two things they've done. You have to validate the A number, and you've got to attest a STIR/SHAKEN attestation on calls coming into the USA with a +1 CLI. The nirvana, again, is all the regulators sit down with all the industry on a global basis and all come up with a wonderful solution that everybody's happy with. Sadly, that's not going to happen. And even efforts on a European basis to try to create a one European standard on global STIR/SHAKEN, on European STIR/SHAKEN, does not seem to be taking off. And it literally is happening, unfortunately, sadly, country by country. The amount of engagement between the US industry and the US FCC and the UK industry and the regulator is there, but quite often that's not actually being listened to significantly. Now, that does not mean we should give up. We should absolutely, as an industry, come out with the most sensible recommendations that we can. Hope and pray, as we said before, we cannot be relying upon the regulators choosing the best option for us, etc. So the more that we can do as an industry together moving forward, the better chance we have of succeeding and actually building our industry for the benefit of the consumers, the benefit of our industry, and the benefit of the enterprise. That's what we need to do. So we really need to get off our rear ends and actually start making proper developments forward, because at the moment it's pointing in the wrong direction.
Well, we're running out of time, but I'll still keep you here. Somebody shout at me, do my work, please. Tell me, what should math do to help these? What's going to happen next? Any ideas? What we need to do as a community? Talk more, talk less, talk to somebody else. Anybody online as well? Anybody would like to share something, what to do next?
Yeah.
Very telegraphically, Ira, say.
Yeah, I'm just waiting to be recognized. Okay, so I think I mentioned that we at one of the panels in Barcelona, when we're asked, will we be a $3 billion industry? And the major point that I made is that if we lose all the OTP traffic of the major brands, we're never going to reach anywhere near that number. We need today to actually do two things. One is go to the brands and say, we're working on it, we're finding a solution, okay, to hold off on any of the other developments that they're planning on doing right now, because if we lose that OTP traffic, that's going to significantly affect the aggregator business. And number two, we can't just say that to them, we actually have to do something as an industry. I think the MEF is already taking some of the steps. I think that if we start, sitting in MEF committees and saying, okay, let's just develop a new protocol, that's going to take too long. I think that we need to look at protocols or at solutions that have already been developed and try as an industry to agree to one of them and then to move forward with that globally. I think that that's something that we have to go forward, because if we lose the OTP traffic, it's a lost ballgame. I hate to be the pessimistic. I'm usually the optimist. It's a lost ballgame.
One word then.
So the MEF initiative on the Send ID registry was a really powerful first step forward, and it shows that the industry can, through the power of the MEF, actually come up with a solution. I think it's fair to say it was a fairly embryonic solution, but having said that, it was an embryonic solution that did actually have an impact in the various countries that it was. But clearly, if we need to take that, we need to develop that into on a more capacity basis, with more production level, certainly looking at the number of enterprises that can be involved in that process. So kind of taking that initiative and looking at what is the next step forward that can be looked at on a global basis might be a useful starting point in that overall picture.
Thank you.
Right, so I think we also need to look a little bit at the interests of the parties, right? If you talk about robocalls in the US and if you talk about the operators don't lose money with robocalls, they make money short term and medium term. What they will lose in time is, as trust goes away from this communication channel, they will lose new legitimate calls and messages and so on. I think industry bodies need to actually bring this awareness to the operators, and to the previous comments from my fellow panelists, I think you need a little bit of implications from the regulators, because otherwise the operators are just making money out of these robocalls. And out of these spam calls, and they don't want to invest more money to lose money, right?
Conflict of interest. And talking of conflict of interest, I'd like to keep you here for longer, but your coffee breaks is calling. I know there is a very interesting question from Igor as well, online on the Q&A, but I think I need to call in a date, just for now. What I'm hearing as well is that we need to keep on talking, educating the market awareness, and progressing the overall understanding. So we will do that, as well as improving, and I have an open conversation of the sender-ready solutions that we are having in UK, Spain, and Ireland. So those two topics have definitely been doing. To the partner here, a big thank you for sharing your experience, your ideas, and your passion on the topic. Passion that I hope you can all share. This is going to be a big thing for MEF over the next 12 months, I believe. So we will hear more from James and myself on this. Now, it's really late for you are here. Please have a coffee break, and we'll come back in about 7 minutes, starting again. And if you're online, we will shortly be here. Bye-bye.